let's explain Wonderland.
Wonderland is like my foray into the world of online discourse and kind of political and philosophical cultural commentary. And it's kind of me trying to present my own set of ideas to kind of resolve some of the, culture war tension that we're all embroiled in, and kind of as a response to some of like those IDW guys I mentioned earlier that I was like listening to talk for then like years on end and having these really interesting conversations, but maybe I'm listening to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris on stage in Vancouver in front of like a few thousand people debating free will. And I'm sitting there in my room being like, you guys are talking past one another. Like there's this really clear thing that would like kind of resolve this conflict, but like neither of you quite seem to be able to see it. And I feel like I can resolve it. So let me go off and write a whole bunch. And then
Okay.
eventually I was like, I want to present these ideas to the internet. So Wonderland, I'd read when the pandemic started, I read Godel Bach. Do you know what that book is?
Yeah. There's
Yeah,
it's a pretty thick book. What's the guy's name?
it's big. Douglas Hofstadter.
Hofstadter. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's been a really big inspiration to me. I think we have very similar interests and kind of think in very similar ways. And Godel Bach, he does this interesting format in the book where it's massive and he'll oscillate between these kind of like analogies, these stories that he has that are very kind of like almost like from a children's book or something that are really playful and cute, and these dialogues. And those dialogues will kind of act as an analogy to then the textual ideas that he's presenting in like the following chapter. So it kind of grounds these more complex ideas because maybe he's doing a chapter and he's talking about like computer programming or like nested systems or something like that. That's like quite abstract, but then he'll have this goofy little dialogue at the top of it to kind of tee you up and keep you a little bit more tickled throughout reading this like otherwise really, really dense, like really kind of academic text. And so I liked that idea. And so with Wonderland, I talk about philosophy and political theory, but I have this fairy tale that kind of keeps the listener engaged as I go through my different ideas.
And so in Gödel Escher Bach, he was talking mostly about patterns, right? Not technology itself, but like a lot of math, right? So what
Yeah,
was he
there's
kind
lots
of
of like
tackling in that book? Like patterns and these just interesting concepts around infinity and recursion and chaos theory, stuff like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. He never like says it explicitly, but he's definitely like a complexity theorist in my view. And yeah, like the book has like a lot of like computer programmers will like kind of hail it as this text that's really great for them because he spends a lot of time talking about computer programming, but that's not actually the thesis of the book. The book is kind of about the central idea that which has to do with like Gödel's mathematical proof that like you can never have a system that can fully represent itself. It always has to speak to something outside of itself.
Huh.
So you can never kind of like have a cohesive representation of reality because then the thing that is the full thing sits outside of it.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
he'll explore this through all these different ways of like if it's Escher's like lithographs where you kind of have these like recursive cyclical systems or like the two hands drawing one another and like there's this like, these paradoxical aspects. And then I didn't like in Bach's music is more about kind of having like these what are they called? Like fugues that kind of you can layer themselves on top of each other and the music gets more complex and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So how does that translate into thinking about resolving the culture war? I mean, maybe culture is war. Maybe resolution is the death of culture. But you're
I think
setting up
that's true to
to
some
resolve
extent.
things. So,
Well, I think I agree with what you're saying in that, like, do you know what the word cybernetics means?
I know what a cyborg is, and are we talking about like transhumanism?
No, cybernetics is like this process of how kind of what you're describing of. I think Jordan Peterson has talked about this too. How it's like you need the left and right to kind of like continually like if like my mom's best example of cybernetics is like imagine if you are at the helm of a ship and you're trying to go straight towards an island over there. But as you're steering the ship, there's going to be wind coming this way and waves coming that way. And so you constantly have to adjust the wheel that you have to keep turning the wheel in different directions to go straight. Does that make sense? Because you have to keep compensating for the environment. It's like a
Okay.
thermostat is an example of a cybernetic system where like it will get feedback. It'll have something that will tell you the room is hotter or colder than this temperature that it wants to be. And then it'll either heat the room or cool the room in order to regulate the temperature.
Okay.
And so the political left and right is kind of the same thing in a democratic system. You need to have like, okay, sometimes you need to have more liberal policies and kind of tilt the direction of the society like this. And then, oh, okay, now you have to more conservative policies to like reorient it this way in response to the external environment, right? Like maybe in war times, you're going to have much more like liberal policies because it's like, okay, guys, we got to band together and like get this stuff. Everyone's got to take care of one another.
Non-liberal. During wartime, that's when freedoms are restricted.
Sorry, I guess I'm thinking also in the sense of like you're going to have like maybe you're going to have government mandated like rations or something like that. So, but yeah, you're going to like kind of tighten up. Like the government's going to have more control for sure.
Okay.
And
so by liberal, you mean centralized? Is that we have to?
Yeah. Sorry. I guess yeah. All these words are conflating with one another.
Words. The introducing a direction when we're talking about a political system or I guess society. Where is society going? And what is left? What is right? What does that mean in relationship to what? And in my own engaging with different thinkers, mostly this year, the past 12 months, I've been focusing on trying to figure out what the right is up to, from, the academic right to, the not quite the total shitposter right, but like the meme zone, right? The more internet commentator stuff, and just trying to figure out, what do you guys mean by right? What do you mean by left? When we complain about the left, what are we complaining about? When we complain about the right, what are we complaining about? And there's different metaphors that suffice, like Michael Malice will say that conservatives are liberals going the speed limit, right? So there's this sense of acceleration, but where's the direction? Where are we headed? What are we trying to go to? And is that in and of itself, that idea that society is going somewhere, or should be going somewhere, a particular type of politic, and not necessarily what politics is or what society is, just like a metaphor that kind of is operating under the seams or under the sentences that's always kind of framing our discourse, which is in and of itself might just be a metaphor. We might not be headed anywhere. Maybe we're overlaying this.
I don't think there's any like collective island that we're sharing. Is like that's where we're trying to go, except for like maybe this very ambiguous and very like dependent concept of like human flourishing or something, right? But then that's going to be so relative to your own dispositions and desires. But that is kind of like that idea of that you're trying to regulate towards something that's okay relative to kind of all the external and cultural and contextual things we're embroiled in at the moment, right?
Okay. Such as what? Just for context, let's date ourselves.
It's just things I'd say like currently, okay, so we've got like, social media is really big and that's going to then impact how we have our political discourse. And so then when you have things like COVID and all the BLM protests and stuff like that, you can very much see that as being a consequence of like these environmental factors that have teed us up. And I think also lots of people have talked about the fact that like we're all much more kind of politically tense and scared because you go online and you quickly find yourself in a niche or a bubble and you get yourself into an echo chamber, and then you go out on the street and you no longer feel political solidarity with like random strangers that might live in your community. You have political solidarity with this niche online group, and then you go out into the world and you're either super woke and you're like all these people are transphobes, or you're going out into the world when you're super conservative and you're like all these idiotic libs, and you get really calcified and kind of angry. And we've very much moved away from having a political vision that is about you in your physical community and what that system looks like, right? It's much more kind of like these fantasy in the cloud systems, and isn't so much more based in like, okay, well, I'm going to go and vote into like my, municipal whatever election and elect some guy. Like that feels so distant from where the discourse is, which is much more ambitious and kind of globalized, I guess, in a lot of ways, right? Like that's the other thing, is that the internet's connecting all of us. And so you're able to carve out these really specific niches that if you'd been living 50 years ago, your political climate is very much just based in like your own community and like, how do we help out the homeless problem that we have, or how do we like change the taxes or whatever it is. And now it's much more like you can dream a lot bigger and you can also get a lot more radicalized.
Yeah. So where do you find yourself over the past, let's just say, year concerned with, like on what in the outside world is what you identify with engaging with, like Canada, the West, Toronto, like where do your eggs of interest lie?
I always am like pretty uninterested in local level politics personally because I'm very interested in political philosophy and this kind of first principles thinking. So I am don't really care too much about like the current like Canadian government or who's in charge of the city that I'm currently living in, just because I'm not a very big like advocate or fan of democracy necessarily. Like I've never voted before,
Okay.
and I don't think my vote would matter if I
Where
chose to
where were
because
you a year ago? Where were you
I was in
living?
the same boat. I think I kind of like two
I
years
mean,
ago, like not
physically
long after. Oh,
living.
sorry, in Victoria.
Okay, so you weren't there for the Toronto trucker protest.
No, but
Or was that
there
in
was
Ontario?
protests going on in Victoria. It was kind of across Canada. So
Oh,
like
interesting.
I lived and worked in Victoria, really close to the Parliament building, and so every single day for basically a year, there was people protesting outside of the building. So you kind of get to witness like little aspects of that.
What did you think about that
Um,
and feel
I'm
about
kind of
that?
like
Like, what was your?
I'm definitely not mad at the people protesting. I think it's fine. It's also kind of funny because it's just a bunch of hippies. And so there's all this kind of like online discourse about these, whatever, racist Nazis or whatever. But then actually in person in Victoria, of all places where it's extremely liberal, it's like, it's just a bunch of hippies that don't want to get any sort of government intervention. So lots of people are kind of like more angry at them, but I never took up that view.
Okay.
But also, I'm not going and like getting my own signed because it's like, well, what? That's kind of the same thing about the not voting. It's like this seems so distant from any actual
Yeah.
consequence. I'd much rather just go home and write my little political philosophy,
Okay.
and I've got much longer term views on
Well,
the matter.
I bring up the trucker protest, or maybe whatever that. I guess that's what it's called now, the convoy or whatever. Even though it was distributed across Canada, because that's one instance of politics breaking out and becoming visible explicitly in the street as opposed to online, right? That and the BLM riots. Were you? How many Molotovs did you catch or block or throw?
I was sitting at home on my roof,
Oh,
minding
really?
my own
Just
business.
with your
Yeah,
little
yeah.
laser sight there? Okay.
Nobody came by my place. It was fine. I
Okay.
was living in Winnipeg when that was going on, and there's definitely like protests going on downtown. And I was like, I don't care
Okay.
about this either.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to get a sense of when the political manifests, right, in the form of a protest, how does that inform your thought? Or are you not thinking in temporal terms? You're still wrangling with what you call first principles. That's where you're at right now. That's what you're
Yeah,
trying
what
to.
you
Okay.
said, the latter
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
Yeah, the protests neither really. I mean, it was interesting. Like when everything was happening with George Floyd, that didn't cause me to sit down and think about like, okay, so what are the problem? What are the actual like structural issues with the police system, and how could we fix those? But like that to me seems like the most interesting question to be answered if you're responding to this instance of police brutality. But that isn't what anyone's talking about. They're either going to be like, we need to defund it or we need to have more social workers. It's kind of all these stupid pleas for things that are nonsensical, but no one's actually just going and being like, these are the things that would make sense to implement. And to me, those are the most interesting questions to answer.
Okay. 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 So when people bring up first principles, I want to ask, well, what is the first principle? Where do we begin? Let's just create a sandbox in one tiny little corner of Wonderland and begin to shape a model.
Yeah. So I start the first episode is titled Philosophy Who Needs It. And it's kind of I inspired by this speech delivered by Ayn Rand in like the 70s of the same title, where she just lays out a basis of what the discipline of philosophy is and why you should care. And that was also kind of partially informed my desire to relay it through a fairy tale because she opens the speech with this story of like an astronaut who goes up into space and crash lands on a random planet, and all of their tools are broken and they don't know what to do. And you're posed with three questions, which is, where am I? How can I discover it? And what should I do? And so essentially the first principles is the fact that you are a conscious being existing in a world, and there's some sort of relationship between you and the world that you can determine and then have to try to navigate.
Okay.
So that's like the starting point, is being like, okay, you have, and that translates into the three domains of philosophy, the three primary ones. So like the question of where am I, that's metaphysics, right? That's like, what is the material substance of the world that we're contending with, and what are the laws that it abides by? The question of how can I discover it, that's the epistemology component. So like, what's the relationship between you and the environment, and how can you collect information?
Okay.
And then what should I do is kind of the moral ethical component of like, well, given this is the context that you exist inside of and this is how you can gather information, what should your actions be from those two previous things.
Okay. Which bleeds into what? Morals?
Yeah.
Ethics? Okay.
Yeah.
How can I discover that? So in another way to reframe that, because discover sounds, it doesn't sound clean enough to me. How do I know? Is that the same thing? How do I,
Yeah.
how do I understand?
How can you acquire knowledge? That's the
Okay.
epistemological question. Yeah.
Okay.
Are your senses, like, are you tangibly interacting with reality, or are you a postmodernist who's like, no, your senses are completely fallible and you can't actually get any meaningful information about the world? Or is it like, if I can see something and touch something, then that means it's there in some meaningful sense? Is my mind capable of rational thought, or is it constantly going to be biased and self-serving? And so then in the second episode of Wonderland, I have the person's trying to like escape a maze in the first episode, and then you're applying these questions to try to navigate the maze. And then the second episode, you get out of the maze and you start exploring a forest. And to me, that's kind of like, for my foundation of philosophy, my like metaphysical basis is complexity theory, which to me is like the process which causes all of reality to unfold. And you kind of discover it through, you're walking through a forest and you look at the trees and then the cracked mud on the ground and the lightning in the sky. And all these things share similar characteristics that cause them to emerge in a specific way. So to me, that speaks to like the fundamental nature of existence is grounded in this process of complex adaptive systems.
Complex adaptive systems. Mm-hmm. Is that the answer to the question, what is a woman? A complex adaptive system?
Frankly, I think you could say yes. And if you were to indulge the idea that, 100 years from now, let's say, if you're just getting into, people can do like pretty, successful hormone replacement therapy and pretty unsuccessful, I'd say, like physical surgeries. But let's say, give technology another 100 years, if you could completely transition in every material sense, then like the definition of a woman is going to be something that's changing and shifting over time, right? So in that sense, you could say, well, it's a complex adaptive system because it's being informed. It's not one consistent static thing over time. It can evolve and change as the environment external to it changes.
Well, it depends on if you anchor, well, it depends on what you would anchor that into. And I was going to bring up birth giving, because birth giving is principally, from a very rudimentary sense, what a woman does, which is what a woman is. But once, or if, uterine implants take place, then that too shall pass onto the hands of everything. Ultimately, in a postmodern technocratic world, depends on whoever wills it to be. Nothing is itself unless it is willed, right? I will a woman into existence by creating one out of myself or out of the world, which is a different stance than a natural orientation or a pre-technocratic, technological orientation towards reality. Like, what is reality in and of itself? So I'm wondering, I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around, but you're making me think.
Okay.
What is a person then? What is an agent in this world? So an agent is someone, somewhere, who has knowledge and capability to do something, or who has the capacity to acquire knowledge and the capacity to do something with that knowledge. Just using your first principles and trying to root what a human being is.
So you're asking what a person is or what an agent is?
Yeah, I guess I was using those terms interchangeably. So
an agent can be basically anything. So I think a person is, what you just described sounds fair enough. But an agent could be like in an ant colony, an ant is the agent.
Okay. All right.
So an agent is just the thing that's kind of moving around and making decisions and informing the kind of structure of the system.
Okay.
But that thing can change over time.
Because I brought up person because I think one thing, and so far as I've investigated the gender aspect, one thing that seems to be manifesting is this quest for self, a quest for authenticity, a quest for parity between one's internal sense of self and the external reflection sense of self. And so I'm wondering, in your philosophical investigation so far, if you've kind of developed a model of what a self is, insofar as a self is somebody who's not just a rational agent, but is also a feeling, desiring agent who's seeking completion, who's seeking satisfaction, who's seeking a number of different things, fleeing from pain, chasing after pleasure.
Yeah, so actually, it's funny you bring that up because the current episode that I'm working on, the next installment of Wonderland, is going to be about consciousness. So that's probably going to be like the closest to your
Oh,
answer,
okay.
which I'm just like delving into
Okay.
text and things. It's still all very preliminary. I'm going to do consciousness. I'm going to do one on the environment and kind of urban planning and environmentalism. And then the one I'm going to do after that, which you'll be interested in, is I want to do my own personal take on all of like the sex and gender discourse, because you kind of have like consciousness in itself, right? Like
Yeah.
just aside from anything else. And then the next step would be like, okay, so now you have consciousness in relation, and now you're getting all these ideas about sex and gender identity and things like that.
Yeah.
So you're asking me what?
Well, I get. What are you asking me? I'm just thinking if we start at the beginning, if we found the thought experiment on an individual rational agent, that's completely different than if you. It might not be. It might converge with this other way of thinking: is that a human being isn't a human being unless it's in relationship with other human beings, right? Like a human being is in dialogue. It's I guess comes to mind. Is it Viktor Frankl? No, he did Man's Search for Me. Martin Buber wrote a book called I and Thou. And it's a very kind of Jewish, poetic, philosophical treatise on how one relates to the world, and kind of establishes this sense that the foundation of reality is dialogue. It's not rational actor, monast.
Yeah, I definitely
monad.
have a
Yep.
feeling that like if you were born on a desert island and you were the only being there, you wouldn't necessarily formulate a sense of identity, right? You'd just be running around eating things and doing stuff. But like I don't think if you were to just exist in a vacuum of consciousness, you would have any sense of like definitely wouldn't have any sense of like a gender identity and things like that. And I don't think you'd have any sense of like, because you have got nothing to compare yourself to, right? So I think those factors of identity must emerge through relation. But I think you can definitely still be like a conscious human being without having goalposts of like, oh, I'm more conscientious or I'm more open-minded or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I interrupted your building your Wonderland. So the first,
Oh, that's okay.
you were talking about your second episode. I should have been taking notes, but you made me think.
It's okay.
And so I ruined everything. But what was the third episode about then?
Oh, I haven't gotten to the third one yet. So the second one I talk about, yeah, like the basis of kind of complexities, the organic basis of reality and how that's informing things. So then the one after that, I talk about emergence and epistemology. So a big component of complex adaptive systems is this idea that like through these different agents interacting, you have emergent phenomena, which you cannot distill in any of the parts alone, but it's through the nature of their interactions. And then this kind of goes on to inform my view of epistemology, which kind of is and what the episode lays out in a large part is like a critique of social science, which I was talking about at the beginning of this. In that, like, we are kind of our minds and the interactions that we have are far too complex, and there's far too many variables interacting and informing one another to kind of come down and say, okay, this like influences this with like a direct causal path here, because maybe there's some causal relationships that are like that, but they're going to be kind of hidden underneath all these other complex dynamics that are constantly informing one another, making it incredibly difficult to extract like one truth and say, this is the only thing that matters. Because really it's like all these relationships are just in this big, like entangled mess. And so it makes me really skeptical of the ability. Sorry?
What was just to give the audience an anchor to the thoughts that you're expressing here, what's the fairy tale for that? Or the moral? Fable.
Oh, so in that episode, like what happens is you encounter like a little cabin, and there's a character named Aunt Hillary, and she's kind of I demonstrated through the idea of like if you have like she's showing you a book and saying like there's words on this page, and the words are composed of letters, or sorry, yeah, the words are composed of letters, and then they go into sentences and all these things. But like if you're just looking at a letter, there isn't any meaning to be found there, right? And then you can add a bunch of letters together, and now we have this emergent thing that is the word where there is meaning, and then you can put a bunch of words together in a sentence, and now there's a bigger emergent concept, and all the sentences can go into paragraphs, which go into a book. So like this, like a fairy tale story, if you're saying like the story of Hansel and Gretel, like is that an idea in essence, or is it a bunch of letters being put together? And then this acts as an analogy to like your brain. Is your brain just a bunch of neurons like pushing one another around, or actually do your ideas that you have in your brain come to possess stronger causal power than the neurons themselves? Where when you're thinking, it's not like your neurons are firing in a specific path, but it's actually you're manipulating concepts and ideas, and those things are the things pushing the neurons around. So when you have emergence, you can kind of get this idea of like bottom up versus top down causality. And the top down causality is like, it's no longer, you could tell the story of Hansel and Gretel in a bunch of different ways, right? There's going to be different texts, and you could tell it to a friend or something, and you're going to use different words every time, but the essence of the story stays the same. So is the story the words being put in a certain order, or is the story this bigger idea that can then inform the different ways you tell it, essentially?
Okay. And how is that, are we getting a sense of like what you're building by the third episode? Like, so you're laying out just foundational concepts, but is there some sort of house or floor plan that we start to see? Like,
yeah, so I'd say like I build up like the idea of complexity because that kind of informs everything else. And then the epistemology component kind of informs the way I approach talking about philosophy and more so political theory. I get frustrated by cultural conversations today where people are just lobbing statistics at one another, because I have the sense that you can take a statistic and kind of use it to support whatever argument you want, right? Like the same number of conservative or liberal arguing antithetical ideals, but they'll use the same piece of evidence to support whatever position they have. Yeah. So the statistics aren't actually where you're finding claims of like truth or knowledge, right? The statistic is just a supporting element. So if you want to speak persuasively, you should just talk about the ideas and the ideals that you have, not getting lost in the minutia of like, well, this study says this and this study says this, and like, how do we make sense of this?
Yeah.
And then from that, I talk about the next episode, the fourth episode talks about free will and determinism, which I think kind of informs different political dispositions people tend to have. The next one gets into morality. And then the second half is like, now I start with political philosophy, and then I start building up a political system. So that's it's all building into like, okay, so I end on kind of like, I'm a pretty like broad libertarian, and then how do you implement that act like in a way that would be successful? And then in this libertarian society, what sort of structures of government you should have? So every single one's building off of the previous in a way that by the end, you've got a very strong idea of like what I think and why, because everything has the rationalization of the previous episode built upon.
Yeah. So how did you get to not libertinism? That's the wrong word.
Maybe you could be a libertine and a libertarian.
How did you get to the Gadsden flag? Why does that have resonance with you?
Because so an aspect of complexity is this idea that you need to have, the concept of like Nassim Taleb's term anti-fragility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So complex systems are adaptive and they're able to survive over time. An ant colony or something isn't a static system that stays the same. It's constantly reformulating itself and responding in relationship to the environment, which means that you need to have diversity and you need to have kind of exploratory mechanisms that are going to look outside, like try different things, because maybe in a certain moment, one ant will wander off in a different direction from the rest of the ants and discover a new source of food. And you could say the same thing about like an economic system, right? If you just had like top-down government mandated, like these are the jobs, these are the things that you do, then you're never actually going to have any room for innovation or new ideas to be discovered that might be preferable. So operating with that basis of like, in order to continually adapt in relation to the environment, you need to have variance in the system, and that variance strengthens it over time rather than weakening it, which is what the anti-fragility idea refers to. So that's where I come up with the like you need to have some essence of individual autonomy to go off and make your own decisions and think your own thoughts and go down your own paths, because maybe you'll discover something new that isn't already in the static culture that you exist inside of. It has to be external to that. Yeah. So that informs the individualism, and which then informs the like libertarianism and my sense of like, I know you've been talking with Curtis Yarvin a lot, and I'm very much like a big fan of his work and this idea that like you need to have political systems that can go off and try something new, and maybe that new system will implement an idea that actually turns out to be really effective, and then that can go back and inform a bunch of the other like nations that currently exist.
Yeah. Libertarianism, my sense of it is that, I mean, ideally, I probably would like that, but most people aren't suited to be exploratory or suited to be, there's just a variety of different instincts and interests. Some people want power, so they'll create structures of power. Some people want control, so they create structures of control. And if a libertarian government comes along, it's going to get populated. If it's strong enough to, do the basic things that it needs to do, it's going to be populated by a bunch of bureaucrats, and then it's going to be not libertarian very soon. I just don't. Is it a stable system? Can you just have like this really loose, handshaky kind of society without a bunch of schemers coming along and facilitating the collapsing of power into centralized forces?
Well, I think this is why I discovered Yarvin's ideas, and I was so moved by them, because I was stuck for a long time between writing the 5th episode, which is about the morality, the individualistic component, and then the 6th episode is called The Structure of Freedom, and that's where I get into the political philosophy. And I was kind of torn for a while because I knew I kind of had these libertarian sympathies, but then I couldn't make sense of well, then why in a democratic society, why would you be electing anyone if you've got a very strict formulation of these are the rules we're going to be abiding by and we're not going to introduce anything else? Then who are you voting into power? That doesn't really make sense anymore. But then also the anarchistic response, which is we'll just go off and do anything, is kind of libertarian in essence, but isn't it doesn't tell you what to do, right? Anarchism to me is not a political philosophy. It's just passing the buck over to somebody else, because it's let the free market decide. But then what the free market is going to decide is, well, let's create a government and these will be the rules of the government. So you still have to have an actual solution to the problem. And so what was your question again? I was going somewhere with that.
Well, yeah, you said that you were stuck and that Yarvin gave you a clue.
Right. Because Yarvin's thing is, okay, so just instead of having a democratic system or just having a completely anarchical system, which isn't an answer to anything, instill power in one source of authority and then let that be the place where, okay, now if you've got a sovereign that's committed to these principles of general individual liberty, then they'll be the one that's kind of securing this as being what their state is offering. And if at some point they slip from those ideals and they're no longer doing that anymore, then they're going to lose their clientele, because you'd think that that's why people are wanting to pay to participate in that system in the first place.
Yeah. But see, if you look at, let's just take my country, America, it's got this beautiful piece of paper that doesn't really have much power, but it's got a lot of heft to it, called the Constitution, right? It actually doesn't. It's just a function. It doesn't have a function anymore other than kind of the symbol. It became a symbol. There was a bunch of ideas about how we want to do this thing, and yet the thing itself, being the government, ends up doing things in its own way, creating all these agencies, gobbling up money and then spitting it out other places, and then it creates this organ called the deep state, or the state that is kind of everywhere all at once and connected everywhere else. And the Constitution, or the idea of America, the idea of freedom, of liberty, of free speech, those are things that are operating on the surface that are kind of allowed more or less, and sometimes less and sometimes more, by the governing structure. And then all of the companies that people use, in a digital world at least, to communicate their ideas, that are also, what we see in the Twitter files, also beholden to this government entity, and kind of serves this one government. So I'm just saying, in practice, it doesn't seem like you can have this. I guess, Yarvin's just make it explicit, make it one thing, make it out in the open, make it as accountable as possible, and then he has this whole crypto thing that I don't really understand. So it's there, and you're square with it. You opt into being ruled by this entity, but it doesn't seem like we as human beings actually do opt in to a lot of things. We don't opt into life. We don't opt into our genetics. We don't opt into our family. We're flung into the world, and then we're bound to that and grow out of that. And then if we have some nominal sense of freedom when we're of age, we're still operating within a system of rules, right, that also emerge out of some sort of boundedness, some sort of organic historical incrustation of custom, right? and common
Yeah,
law and stuff
yeah.
like that. So,
That's why I say like the state of nature is inherently anarchical because like what you just said, you're born into circumstances that you did not consent to. It doesn't matter if you're born under like a tyrannical, like if you're in North Korea or if you're a slave in some country or if you're born into a democratic system. You never signed up for this. And so the question isn't like is like you're kind of it's innately invalid whatever political system you're existing inside of. So the question then becomes like how do I opt out of this and opt into something that's preferable and more in alignment with my ideals.
yeah.
And what you're saying about like the American Constitution is like the paper document and may have these really liberal principles to it, but the paper document has no physical control over all the things that have then come out of it in the couple hundred years. So and what you're saying is also correct that like, okay, so you could have some like Elon Musk could tomorrow be like, I am declaring I have a new, island that's going to be a liberal utopia and have all these amazing things. And people could go and move there and to live out their libertarian fantasy. And then it could be like 20 years down the line, for whatever reason, that starts kind of corrupting internally and gets a little bit more stagnant and a little bit more fixed. And that's why my vision of political philosophy is always going to have this idea of like, sure, so if that system becomes stagnant, again, then you escape and you go create a new one. And there's constantly this idea of like, things are going to solidify into static systems. And then you need to have something dynamic that can kick you out. And then you'll create a new system. And then over time that might solidify. So it's a continual process of renewal. And those things will probably inevitably get corrupt over time, right? Like every revolution brings about a new regime. And then that one will, so it's a continual process. But if you can at least be aware that this is the thing that's occurring and you actually have the agency in order to opt out and build something better when those current structures, those institutional structures get too solidified and calcified.
Yeah.
But it's putting that idea in the consciousness of the people, right? Because nobody currently is thinking along those lines. They think if I want to make political change, I have to go and rally and do the democracy thing, which isn't very effective. And there's no thought really. I mean, now it's getting popularized because of the internet and because of people like Curtis or Balaji who are kind of advocating for these network cities. And that's going back to the topic of our conversation of like, I think the internet's going to enable a new era of within the next century, there's going to be a lot more people that get excited about like, yeah, let's just go off into the boonies and do our own thing. And then the only thing that's really holding people back from that is the fact that like all the land in the world is occupied currently, right? So like it's going to be very difficult to carve out a niche for yourself to have like physical territory that you can actually exert power over. But if you make the philosophical allowance of that being a possibility at any level, then it's an interesting question of like, so what do you do with that new territory you've created? And maybe it's not on Earth, right? Like maybe my political philosophy will be implemented on Mars when Elon Musk goes and like it's supposed to be kind of unhindered by the current context it's existing inside of and just be a broad solution to keep in mind this idea of escaping the thing you're stuck inside of to make something better.
You bring to mind James Lindsay's, he spoke to me about several times about this postmodern Marxist, neo-Marxist educator guy, Paul Freire, who also advocates for eternal struggle, for eternal revolution, for the continual breakdown of any sort of normativity and escape to another normativity, and always going towards this. When somebody describes something like that, this continual just jumping to another place or tearing down and rebuilding, there's still a sense of direction there, is there not? There's still a sense of, in Freire's case, I don't really understand what he wants, but it seems like some sort of utopia where everybody is equalized constantly. Everybody is liberated constantly from all of the chains of oppression, whatever that means. So in the moral dimension of this, maybe not moral is the right word, but the ought or the desire, like what is the direction? You kind of hinted at it with whatever suits anybody's given desires, but where do those desires lay, and how do you shape people's desires in such a way that they do perpetuate towards some sort of better direction?
I don't know who this guy is you're describing, but I'd say like I don't think like escaping for the sake of it, like this idea of continually revolting just because that's like a good thing, I don't buy into, right? I think there's absolutely good things with the static patterns. It's just when they stop serving you, then that the escape should be an option, but that isn't necessarily like you could be in a static pattern that's actually good and functional for a while, and then escape is not the thing you want to do. And then I'd also say that I'm a big proponent of having like a multiplicity of political solutions, just like you want to have a multiplicity of like options in a market or something like that. So my ideal liberal utopia may not be yours, right? And I think there's very valid reasons that people in the future may want to exist in like a back to the land or very collectivist communist type society where you're living very simply and you're living with the advantages of technology. Or you might want to live in like a techno utopia with all these great things available to you. And there's no innate conflict between those two groups, right? Like people should be able to exist in whatever political system serves them. And actually, if you have a multiplicity of options available to you, being able to navigate between those would actually kind of be the ideal thing, right? Because there's going to be times when the back to the landers need to have access to life-saving technology that isn't on their little like hippie commune. And there's going to be times when the people in the techno utopia want to have like organic vegetables or something. So the both can actually help the other. And personally, like my attempts with Wonderland is to kind of sketch out like, okay, so if I was sovereign of my own state,
Yeah.
these are the rules I think would make sense that fall in line with my values, and
Okay.
I'll do the best I can. But it's a continual process of like, this isn't the only solution. And if you've got issues with the things I'm proposing, like, please come and tell me, because to me, the idea of constructing something functional and idyllic is a very fun process.
So what are your values? Like, what is this state of Jane?
I think I've kind of, it's interesting because I've kind of come around to like a socialism via libertarianism or via monarchism, right?
Okay.
Where like I think it's important to have, basic social safety nets for people, but also maybe not implemented in the way that we're currently doing it, right? So like in the eighth episode of Wonderland is called Protection and Police, and I kind of talk about like having these community centers which act as like a hub, as like a node, a centralized spot where you can go to access government resources. And so it's like this is just the place to go if you need to have like a place to sleep, food to eat, medical assistance, resources. You'd have like parks and gardens nearby. So it's like it becomes a very explicitly designated area for people to come and gather and do things and access safety when they need it. So that's like quite like a socialist idea, you could say. But also my idea would be like, okay, so if you need a place to sleep for the night because you're homeless or whatever, you can go and sleep at the center. But the next morning you're going to wake up and they're going to say, okay, John, you need to peel some potatoes and do some weeding and like feed back into the system because you took something from it and now you're going to put value back in. So that way when a guy shows up and he needs something to eat, you've already peeled the potatoes for the stew or whatever. And so there's a sense of like responsibility. You're not taking something for nothing, right? Like in Canada right now, if you go on welfare, you're just taking, and actually I think it kind of is morally draining to not have any responsibility placed on your shoulders of like, yeah, and you should be feeding back into this in some meaningful sense.
Well,
And
how
that
would
can
you do
kind of
that
keep
in
the
Canada?
system
How would
fed.
you charge people for welfare in Canada, in a modern state or country?
I would like, if you wanted to implement that here, I'd say like the solution would be, okay, so you're unemployed and the government's giving you a check for $1,500 a month to live. They're also going to give you a work assignment of, okay, and show up at this whatever it is, a space where you're going to be providing some basic physical manual labor that anyone can do. And like if you're unemployed, it should be giving you employment and fixing the problem that way rather than just writing you a blanket check. And then, if you're severely disabled or something like that, I've got all these different things I talk about of like, oh, okay, so you could have, I think Garvin talks about this too, of having like dependents. So like if you're a citizen and you have a child that needs to have help or something like that, then like, okay, they could become a ward of the state and a dependent of the state. But that would be a very small minority of the people, because I think most people that are currently in that position, they don't necessarily have to be, but we've kind of constructed a society where that's the easiest option, is just to kind of kick back and be like, oh, well, I'm inept for these reasons, and so I can't do anything. But I think that's very psychologically demoralizing, and people would thrive in a situation that actually says, no, you can provide and you can help, and let's help you a little bit and hold your hand and like teach you to fish, and then you can feed yourself, and you're not just handing out fish forevermore,
Yeah.
because that's not very sustainable.
But that's operating on an ethic, a work ethic. So how do you promulgate ethics through Wonderland?
Like, how do you instill these values in the society? So the last episode I plan on doing in the entire series is education. It's going to be the 18th one, which I'm not yet started on. But I would say, like, generally speaking, I don't think you necessarily need to have like state mandated like education, outside of like, basic securities of, kids should know how to read and write and things like that. But I do think that like it's kind of bizarre to me that the one thing we are not taught, at least in Canada, in the public school system, is actually how the government functions or why it functions in the way that it does, which is bizarre to me, because you grow up not knowing what your rights are, what the laws are. Like no one ever tells you like, oh, okay, this is how you know, pay your taxes, or this is what it means to be a Canadian citizen, and these are the responsibilities that you've been endowed with. You're just expected to figure it all out, which seems absurd because like I frankly should be allowed to go and start stabbing people because it's like, well, no one ever said to me explicitly like this is not okay to do. Like you kind of grew up knowing vaguely, clearly because of the culture that you're in. So to me, like the one thing that should be mandated for anyone who wants to be a citizen of this potential regime is like, these are the principles through which we've constructed this society. You should have an understanding of the philosophical basis of it. And then these are the subsequent rights and responsibilities that are expected of you. And if you don't agree to those terms, then you just don't become a citizen. Everything's going to be volitionally based, right? So if you're born into the regime and for whatever reason you don't want to stick around any longer, then good luck to you. But it's going to be based on your own consent and your own, like, you know, actual like a signing of a social contract, and not just like I turned 18 and now I have to pay taxes and do all these things. Like no. Like your citizenship should be like a sliding scale, like maybe between 15 and 25 or something. At any point you can go, I'm a grown up now and I will agree to have these rights and I will become a proper citizen and I'll no longer be a dependent of my parent. But it's based more on your own regulation. Some people will be younger and some people will be older when they decide like, okay, I want to take this next step and have these additional rights and responsibilities.
Huh. We're running up against a foundational liberal principle of consent. And I only do what I elect myself to do, right? And very American ideal, like everybody's going to opt into this thing. But that value of consent is kind of, especially in Canada for some reason, it's kind of running up against the boundaries of other values, like with the maids thing, the medical assistance and dying thing. And you know, can one just consent to die? Is that all that it takes, right? Can I consent to change my gender? Can I consent? I mean, we don't have to go here, but can I consent to end the life of a baby that's not threatening my own life, you know, because it's my body, my choice, right? So I see that you need to inform, there has to be some pre-information that guides consent, right? And then also there's coercion too, no matter how you cut it, in the form of power, and the form of, you know, prison, I guess, you know, or police violence, or, you know, there's just coercion. And then there's manipulative coercion, there's softer coercion, like a more social coercion, like a scarlet letter would be more explicit, or a stockade to embarrass or to tear down somebody's reputation. But that stuff kind of, even if it's not formalized in the public square, still going on behind the scenes with regard to how people shame each other towards certain behaviors and away from other behaviors. And if it's all consent, then again, and it's something about sex and death. This is where the trouble always is, like with the kink shaming, and like, should that be public or not public? Do you consent, you know, to be in a rainbow city or not in a rainbow city and stuff? So there's got to be, I know you're creating a clean system, and I'm trying to like see what happens when dirt is introduced into it, and then how do you counteract moral decay of a society, right?
Well, I think from what you're saying, like it's impossible to have like perfect consent in any sense then, right?
Yeah.
Like, because then you'd have to have perfect information and no coercion. Like that's literally impossible, right? You could be born and be like, well, I didn't consent to work, and like, well, fair enough. But if you don't, like there's a natural consequence of that too. So I think, like, you know, consent has got to always be operating within natural boundaries, right? Just because you can never know everything. And existence itself is non-consensual, clearly. So you're never going to really bottom out of being like, okay, everyone.
And does the state have enough power if it's just based purely on consent? Right? Does it have enough power to stand as a state and do the things that it needs to do, like protect itself from criminal elements within and threats from without? So
like Balaji's idea, you know who Balaji Srinivasan is?
No, can you spell that so I can write that out? What's his name?
I'm so bad at like spelling out loud. I have to spell it out myself. Bealagi.
E-A-L.
No, sorry, there's no B-B. B-A-L-A-J-I.
B-L-A-J. Oh, okay. I'll look him up. A writer.
I mean, like political philosopher. He's done a lot. So I think like Curtis and him are good friends. They go back years, I think.
Where is he at, or how old is he? Is he just a little bit
I have no clue
biographically?
how old he is. I'm assuming he's like in his 40s or something.
Okay. Is it
But he wrote a
ship
book
stacker?
called The Network City
Okay.
recently, and kind of is a similar proponent of the same ideas. But then his whole thing is like, before you go off and actually start a new regime on the ground, you need to create a body of people that want to participate in this thing, and you do a
Yes.
lot of like crowdsourcing just in the digital realm of like, let's get a community, let's get a constitution or a charter, let's figure out all these nuances of how we want this structure to operate, let's even like start a basic economy, be able to have some crypto token associated with it, so you can have like, you can be trading goods and services that aren't so material based. And you can create a sense of community first, and then be like, okay, boys, we've been doing this for a while. We have all a very shared sense of values and the things that we want. And now we're all going to go collectively take some of our tokens and go buy this plot of land and go occupy it and do all the rest of it. So you'd be starting with already a basis of like, okay, we've got our 10,000 first citizens here, and they're all on the same page about this. You're not starting from scratch.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's the only real way to implement something like that.
I would say I keep on coming back to the religious question. I think you need a mythology. You need some sort of imaginal propagation thing. I guess he called education. I just think there has to be a story. There has to be something that keeps people a people. Like, there's got to be a destiny, an origin, and then a mythos, and then an ethos that's attached to that mythos. Like, there's got
Why
to
do you think you
be.
need that?
Well, I don't. In order for so if you look at what happened through almost every organization in the last 20 years, from knitting circles to new atheism, all of them got infected by something that's basically a religion called wokeness or progressivism, social justice, that had a very powerful emotional pull over people. It gave people the ability to judge each other. It gave people the ability to put a direction onto their movement, right? We're moving towards justice. There was an end. There was telos there. And I guess I still have to figure out like what kind of institution hasn't been infected by that. Because if you look, it's everywhere. It's in every actual elite institution. Every formal institution has this aspect to it, or is vulnerable to this. So if you're going to create, and so I just use that as kind of a counterexample. If you create a body of 10,000 people, how do you know that they're not going to turn tyrannical? How do you inform this community that there will be certain standards of behavior that will guide them into getting what they want, and then perpetuating their desires, their group desires, to the children, to the next generation, to congeal that city state. So there's got to be a mythos there.
I think, I don't know, like, I see what you mean about like the power of like stories or whatever, but like even what you're saying with the social justice, it's not like there's like a mythos narrative there. I think like maybe what you're speaking to is just like, you need to have this shared sense of like values, like a shared philosophical basis of the society where it's grounded in you're sharing certain orientations towards the world.
I don't think values are strong enough. I think it has to be a direction.
You're doing something. Okay, that makes sense. I was talking with your Yarvin like a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying like kind of the problem with trying to all these new like newfangled city states is that like no one's going to even sacrifice their little pinky finger to like actually secure the longevity of the regime.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
So you can kind of maybe instate more change when things are a little bit more turbulent or something like that. But in the current day and age, it's like there's too much kind of cozy comfort and security to stay in my little Toronto apartment that like, well, do I really want to cut off an arm to go and create something better somewhere else if it's going to involve actual risk and loss and things like that? So I think that's true to some extent, but then I also think I fall more into like, I don't know, do you know what praxis is?
That I know what the word is, but there's all these different.
Oh, sorry, not the word itself, but like the Praxis Society is like one of these groups that's trying to go off and start a new place to live in the Mediterranean somewhere. They're trying to create an independent sovereign city-state.
In the Mediterranean?
Yeah, they've not yet announced exactly where it's going to be.
Okay, so they got an island, basically.
Yeah, potentially. It's very unclear to me exactly how far along they are in this adventure. And they're trying to kind of rally around these ideals of like vitality and things like that. But I think you're right in the sense that from what I've witnessed of the group, it seems like it's kind of like they're trying to implement maybe some Falaci's ideas of like, okay, yeah, get the community online first, and then you go off and territorialize later. But there's no philosophical coherence that's kind of keeping the group together. So like in the Discord server, there'll be people being like, well, clearly in our education system, you can't have women teaching people, like, because like, there's just some like right-wing idiots involved, and there's some other guys, and people have all these different value systems, and they're kind of trying to crowdsource from the bottom up, like, okay, what should we do? And to me, that's the wrong way to go about doing it. And this is again where I fall much more in line with like Yarvin's ideals of like, I like the idea of someone just coming and being like, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And if that sounds appealing to you and that speaks to something that you value, then come on board. But I think, like, I don't know, maybe with time that will change, like in terms of how much people are actually willing to sacrifice their daily comforts. But I also don't necessarily think, I think I'm just pretty broadly optimistic about, give it 100 years and much more discourse online and people kind of realizing that they don't need to be stuck in the structures that they exist inside of. I think with the rise of like technology and also just how much easier it is to move around, right? Like if you think about human history of old, like getting somewhere was a big deal. And now you can kind of just hop on a plane and go anywhere you like. So I don't know, how much do you need to have like a narrative glue? I think the narrative glue is going to be looking around and going like, well, this sucks, right? Like, and the idea of being able to be part of something better and building that, I think that to me, that feels like a strong enough pull. But maybe you need to have like the current order fall apart a little bit more. Things have to get a little bit worse materially in the current structures that we're existing inside of.
That the decay is a push, but it's not necessarily a pull. Like it's not,
But that's why I think you need a strong vision of like, this, let me present to you a charter, and you'll read it and you'll go, wow, wouldn't I love to live in a place like this? And you get 10,000 people all on the same page and you go $10,000 a year for all of you. And suddenly you've got like, and you get some venture capital, like you could just get the whole thing going. But to me, like the pull will be having an actually tantalizing place to go and live with actually tantalizing structures of government that are different than the ones we currently exist inside of. Because I'm not sure about like the current model city states like Prospera and things like that. How much they're actually implementing new ideas or how much they're just kind of recreating current Western norms in Honduras or something, but they're not like substantially modifying anything about the structures of government or how societies are organizing themselves in ways that would feel like a meaningful enough change. So a lot of what I'm trying to do with Wonderland is be like, you can have big structural changes on the governmental level and then also like on the urban fabric level of there's better ways to be, our cities, it's like, I get frustrated with the fact that I feel like our cities are going to be stuck in current systems and like ways of operating just because like kind of you get these feedback loops where it's like, okay, well, people drive cars and you use electricity like this and you do things like that. And there's never going to be enough incentive to change things in the current systems that you exist inside of because it'll be too expensive and people won't like it and there'll be all these problems. But if you're going to go off and, into Nevada or something, carve out a bit of desert and be like, we're going to build a city from scratch. Now we can actually instill from the ground level all these modern technologies that we have available to us and make like an actually modern city of the future. But you couldn't implement that on a broad scale in a city like Toronto because it would just be way too complicated, right? You're fighting too much of an uphill battle. Whereas having that blank slate allows you to be like, okay, we're going to be doing, self-driving cars and we're going to have, autonomous lights or something like that. Like you could kind of have all these technologies implemented on the bottom. And then I think that would be the pull, having people be like, I want to participate in this because it would be a meaningful, very meaningful change from the status quo that they're existing inside of.
So what do you do with corruption?
Corruption's, I think, like kind of inevitable, but then I also think like that's why I'm tickled by this idea of like explicitly intertwining like money and power, like physical power into one thing. And that way it's like there's no reason for somebody to, or there's no way somebody can buy out the sovereign if the sovereign's like, but I've got a good light. Like, I don't want to, I'm already getting paid handsomely enough. Then how are you going to be bought off, right? Like, why would you corrupt your principles if you're already making good money doing what you're doing, right? Like the reason you can have corruption in government right now is because, well, if this politician's underpaid, then you give him a bit of cash here and then he can kind of be a little bit more. But if your financial success is dependent upon you upholding the values you claim to uphold, then the moment you start sacrificing those values, all of your citizens are going to be like, well, what the fuck? This isn't what I paid for, right?
So somehow some sort of blockchain tech that ties links monetary value directly to performance or behavior. Is that not a form of social credit then?
not sure what you mean by blockchain tech linking value.
Well, I just, how do you bind finances to, how do you decorruptify it by making performance and value synonymous? Or you said force and money, but I'm trying to tease out your idea a little bit more.
I'd say, like, you know, if I'm paying for a Netflix subscription or a phone service and it stops working, then you're not going to be paying for that much longer, right? Like, if the idea is like, I'm coming to you and saying, this is what I'm offering and it's going to cost this much, it's a very clear one-to-one like relationship between what you're giving and what you're getting. And so the moment that relationship starts getting messed up at all, and you're like, well, wait a minute, I'm no longer being delivered upon the things that you told me I'd get, well, then you stop paying, you leave, you go somewhere else. So I think also part of this is dependent upon, like, kind of having like this like patchwork politic of like, you've got multiple things that are competing with one another, and that way they're all kind of keeping the other in check, because you know you can just lose your clients and they'll go somewhere else that might be preferable. So I think part of that is just having multiple systems that are doing this concurrently in tandem with one another, and then people are navigating between them rather than just having one alternative, because then that thing will atrophy in the same way.
Yeah. I think that there's something different about government than a, food court, right? You can't just like unplug from one government and go to the next government like you're walking from the Chinese noodle shop to the, ice cream store. But there's no sense of belonging, and therefore there's no sense of sacrifice, and therefore it's all distilled down into consensual monetary relationships based on performance. Right? There's no moral authority there. There's no sense of belonging there. That's an uprooted system, and it's not coherent from a natural kind of view of what human being is, which is a being connected to an environment that belongs somewhere, right? That loves a place.
But our sense of belonging is kind of like very rapidly getting uprooted as well, right? Like relative to other points when you would kind of be born somewhere and you die in the same place, and your father lived there and his father lived here. It's like, I've been moving around the country like crazy. And so I think you're right in that, like, if you're living in one place and this is where my friends and family are, and then you're like, well, I don't like the changes that they're making, so I'm going to uproot and go somewhere else, then you're kind of fracturing some of those ties. But at the same time, that's just what moving is, right? And then also if you're feeling that strong, then I'd assume that probably other people in the community would be feeling the same sort of way after some point. They might have different thresholds of what they're willing to tolerate. But I think broadly speaking, like, that the problem of feeling like there isn't necessarily enough congruency between like you and the place that you're living is already a problem as we're currently existing.
I mean, I don't know how you would enforce that, but the question, there is at least a question to consider about what is lost when uprootedness, again, back to that, just that rational agent that just decides to move and then moves again, changes their thinking, changes their thought, goes on to another thing, rationally decides to be another thing. There's a lot left off the table, like families, women, what happens when there's a dependent system going on, and the corruption of a bad marriage, right? And then how do you solve for class differences, class distinctions, lower class, upper class, coarse and fine people? How do they coexist, right? What are the tensions that regulate the relationship between the lazy and the hard worker, Is it all mitigated through a monetary system? Is that kind of what
I'm just a little confused,
trust?
Because aren't these problems that you'd kind of encounter in any society?
Yeah. There are.
Yeah, so I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. I'm not saying that I'm trying to construct something where there's not going to be any issues anymore. I'm just trying to look around and say, well, I think we can do better than what we've currently got. That's all. And
so by better, you mean a patchwork of systems that are kind of pickup games politically, that people can choose to be involved in or go somewhere else. And what if there's no place that suits this person? I mean, you'd have to have 10,000 places, right?
But you're already existing inside of that, right? Like, I'm not saying that every single person's going to live in a perfect utopian society in exact accordance with their ideals. I'm just thinking that there's a lot of other ways that people could live that exist outside of the norms that we've created, and I think we should be able to explore those systems.
Yeah. And how do a people live? Like, is there an aesthetic component to your vision yet?
I've fallen into this a little bit more recently where beforehand I wasn't necessarily so interested in the idea of like I really just wanted to establish a political philosophy that I thought could like outlive me and go on to inform what I said earlier, like people colonizing Mars or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then lately I was like started combing through Pinterest boards and looking at beautiful architecture and things and like beautiful landscapes and realizing like, oh, I am kind of actually tickled by this idea of like I really love beauty and beautiful environments, and I want to cultivate a space that's beautiful. And I always kind of feel a little bit frustrated in that like my surroundings can never be as wonderful as I want them to be. And so lately I've gotten a lot more excited by the idea of like, well, yeah, what if you could actually just in practice within my lifetime, like construct a place that is going to be a little bit more aesthetically wonderful than the current norms that we're existing inside of. Because I think that, again, going back to like, well, what's a pull? Like, I think that's a massive pull if you're going, look, it's beautiful here and we've done things well and we've thought things through. And yeah, I'm sure there'd be high premiums on citizenship for something like that. But also, I think you kind of need to have, in the same way that, like the first television sets or whatever, it's like that's like a very high-end premium thing that only the wealthiest people have access to. I think the first like sovereign city-states are going to be things where it's like, yeah, of course this is going to be for people that are extremely wealthy, because who else can afford to adopt this risk and have a secondary citizenship for some experimental place and then also maintain all their current home structures and things. Yeah. But once you have that first echelon of people go off and go, okay, we're going to create a beautiful society, and you'll only spend 2 months out of the year or something, and you get to enjoy all these differences in ways of living. Then after a few more iterations, that will become watered down and available to more and more people.
So like a gated community, just with a little extra thing going on there.
With a lot extra, yeah. But at the same thing of like, yeah, gated communities are like, lots of my kind of philosophy is also based on this idea of like having, just in the same way that you'd want to have, like, you can constantly get out from like the current thing that you're inside of, the current system should also have different substructures within where you're maybe being subjected to different rules. So you could have some areas that are really high premiums, gated community-esque, like this is going to be the most lavish, the most beautiful, we'll have really high standards of regulation and things. And there'll be other areas where like this is a bit more like the Wild West, where like anything goes, we've really like tapered down all the regulations to the barest of bones. There's not going to be any like government infrastructure. It's all going to be like come and build it yourself and do it yourself. And then people will want to participate in those things as well. And then you can have variances within the specific society where you can be providing different modes of living.
And what kind of aesthetic would you imagine if you're creating an AI generated city? Like, what are the keywords that you
I'm a big I love architecture that's like really constructed with high awareness of the environment that it's situated inside of. This is, I don't know if you know like Ayn Rand's like the Fountainhead, but this is kind of like the aesthetic philosophy of the protagonist, where it's like, and kind of like, modernist architecture, like Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and stuff, where it's like you're constructing this thing and you're with complete awareness of this is where the sun moves, that's where the water is, these are where the trees are, this is where the rocks are, this is where the stream runs. Let's create something that is integrated into the environment in a way that feels like it's not kind of like, I think a big problem with like, especially downtown Toronto, is like people are just shoving skyscrapers wherever they can be. And there's no sense of like, well, if you put this skyscraper here, you're blocking this guy's view. And actually, if you rotate it this way, they'd have a better view. That like, it's just kind of anything goes. So I like the sense of an environment where it's constructed with a very high awareness of the natural world. And it's going to be appreciating that and deriving the most value out of that it can get. I like kind of really, sorry.
Continue.
Oh no, I just like really like kind of austere architecture, or like kind of like one thing that Praxis talks about, which I do appreciate, is kind of like we've lost the sense of having monuments or like great buildings, right? Like if you think back of like other places in the world or throughout history where you're going to build like the Taj Mahal or something like that, or like these massive cathedrals, well, that can only be done when you have a singular power authority with a lot of money at its fingertips. And then it can go off and create these beautiful buildings that become like, landmarks of the culture. But the Canadian government has absolutely zero incentive to go and like build a massive structure that's going to be like a place that people gather and come to appreciate. So I think our like aesthetics have actually decreased over time, in part because you don't have money and authority centralized in spots where somebody can go and say, yeah, we're going to spend $100 million and create this beautiful building, and it's going to go live for centuries and centuries beyond us. It's like, no, this skyscraper is going to go up for 50 years. We're going to get as much money as we can. It'll fall down. Who cares? Like, it's too short-term thinking. Whereas like if you have something where you've got the power more concentrated, then you can have a longer term vision of like, we want to build something that's going to last, actually.
Yeah, I mean, Canada can't even get its infrastructure to operate efficiently. Speaking of the medical industry, just seems like in pretty dire straits, right? So there's just a lot of overhead and a lot of waste. But I don't know how, like, if we fast forward time, there is a trend of people hiring more and more private security, especially in certain areas of America where they can afford it and where they need it. And if those security forces get stronger and stronger, eventually they'll kind of turn into de facto military units, and basically the power might coalesce. But how do you do something like Medicare or something on a large scale for millions of people, supporting them with some sort of safety net or another without extracting resources from the entire, population, right? It's just, I don't know how America converts, because there's so much momentum in the current system and it's doing so many things as it is, and the patterns of resource allocation and gaining and giving out, redistributing funds, it's just so entrenched. So eventually there might be some sort of decay. There's plenty of land, though. I just don't know how you envision the apocalypse and then the rebirth into patchwork.
I don't think you need to have an apocalypse. I'm not looking for like the ruin of America or anything. I think like you can have these little divergent ants go off and do different things without sacrificing the integrity of the colony. Like, absolutely, people will want to stick around inside of the democratic systems they're born into, and that's completely fine. Part of my hope, too, is that like just by thinking through things from a first principles basis and kind of getting to these interesting conclusions, even if you're never necessarily implementing these things like tactilely on the ground, that can still inform some of the kind of current policies that we have, right? Like, oh, okay, so like just because I'm coming up with all these insane ideas and saying, well, in a little fantasy land, wouldn't it be nice if XYZ happened?
Yeah.
Some of the conclusions that I come to, you can still then bring back down and say, okay, well, how do we want to resolve some of the issues in the current structures that we're living inside of? Well, maybe have like I'm a big proponent of like Georgism or something like that. So like having like land value taxation and like kind of, and my ideal would be like abolishing land ownership. But even if you just taxed land more heavily than you currently do, like that would kind of reorder things in a way that I think would be a dramatic improvement when you're talking about like rent-seeking behavior and stuff like that. So the policies could inform the current democratic societies that we're existing inside of, even if they're not ever implemented in like the purest possible form. It's still like extracting solutions, or like the community center thing is like, I think that is a valuable idea of like, if you're going to go and take a resource because you need it, you can also provide back into the same thing and create the circular loop. That'd be very easy to instate if you just have more people thinking along those lines.
Yeah. How does this? I missed the word about the taxing land, no land ownership. Georgism isn't like. Won't that just pass the buck to the renters from the rentees, or to the rentees from the rentals? Right. If you're just taxing the land,
you would just tax it at a rate so that if you've got like an apartment building or something, and it's going to be like giving access to like, it's going to be providing homes for this many people, you tax it accordingly so that it's in line with whatever. So like you would if they're like the landowner, or sorry, if the like building manager is providing the normal value of like, oh, there's a gym downstairs and there's a laundry chute and there's things for maintenance, it's like that enhancement of quality of life that they can profit off of. But the idea of just being like, well, I got here first in this, really expensive, now lucrative, like downtown Toronto property, you shouldn't be able to own land in perpetuity just because you got there first. It doesn't really make sense to me. Like, this is one of the things I talk about in Wonderland too, just like that. Land is kind of like the only like truly finite resource that we have. And so you have to kind of treat it differently than other aspects of the economy. And I don't necessarily think that having land ownership in perpetuity is effective. I think the idea actually is like the government is the one that is securing that land for you. And so you can pay tax to the government to continually kind of affirm that relationship. But like if Canada was to come and get invaded by the United States or something, and you're like, hey, no, look, I've got a lease right here. Like the invader is not going to care. Like Canada, the Canadian government is the thing securing, your relationship to the land. It's not you that you own it somehow. It's the relationship with the government.
Huh. What do you think about land acknowledgements then? Just get a little cultural.
I think they're so funny. I think it's kind of like doing the opposite of the intention, which seems to be like really rubbing it in the Indigenous people's face. Like, haha, just if you hadn't like thought about it already, we are on your land. Just take a minute and really think about this. I think it's really stupid. My friend was showing me there's like applying for job positions at like George Brown College in like Toronto, and the job postings, every single job posting, the top of the job posting is a land acknowledgement.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Like it's just absurd. I think it's really dumb.
That's what I'm saying. Like these systems always get infected by the human and the cultural, and that's kind of, I guess that'll just going to happen on its own. And either you're going to have certain antibodies for certain behaviors, or you're not going to have antibodies for certain behaviors, and those behaviors are going to crop up or not. So my domain is more the cultural, psychological, and when I try to inhabit a world such as you are building, which is brilliant, and you're putting a lot of effort and you're really thinking through the whole thing. My imagination approaches it like a novel. Like, okay, well, what's the texture like going to be? Where's evil going to be in this system? Where are the hiccups? And then where are the villains and the heroes going to emerge in a system if we just built this system up? That's just how my mind populates.
That's which is good. I'm very open to kind of critique or people being like, well, wait, what about this? Because I think, again, that's kind of to me the most interesting questions is like this constant conversation and going back and forth of like, okay, well, I think this and you have this concern and okay, well, let's talk that out and map it through. But hopefully with the shared goal of like, you want to make something better, right? If you're just going to be completely like cynical and like, well, nothing's ever going to change. And it's like, okay, then it's not very an interesting conversation anymore. And I think, of course, like you always have to say, yep, corruption's possible. People are capable of evil like that. You're never going to create a society where that it's completely left by the wayside. But I do think you can approximate and refine something that's better than our current structures. And I think like the bar is pretty low, frankly, right now. Like, so I'm just interested in where people's imaginations can bring them.
Yeah. So you deposit your thoughts in this thing called Wonderland, which I know is a podcast, but it's also a Substack. Like where is this and what is the form?
So it's on like welcome to wonderland.substack.com. I made it so like the Substack will now host podcasts, which is very convenient. So now the episodes will be released. It's like both you can listen to it, or like in the same post will be like the whole body of text. Because some people prefer to read, some people prefer to listen. When I started making it, I was kind of like, for a while I thought maybe I'd make YouTube videos, but then that kind of has this whole like other video editing component, which to me felt like that's kind of adding so much more time and energy. And most of the time when I'm listening to a YouTube video, I'm listening to it. I'm not like necessarily sitting and watching the entire thing if it's mostly speech based. So you can listen to it. Some people complain, like the earlier episodes, I deliver it in like a really slow pace, which really irritates some people, and other people love it because it's kind of like ASMR-y. I was inspired by like, as a kid, listening to like bedtime books on tape, like that you'd go to sleep to. So kind of having this like gentle, dreamy delivery. But people kind of love or hate that. So it's available as text as well, if you prefer. And recently I've kind of making the second season, I'm paying a lot more attention to like adding in images and kind of italicizing things and hyperlinking things and making it a more pleasant reading experience as well. So it's available however you want to consume it. And I want to venture into like, I have a YouTube channel too. So I'm starting to do live streams where I kind of want to facilitate the sort of discussion we've been doing of like, okay, I'm thinking about these things and like, let's talk about it and let's critique it and let's explore it. And like, I want to build a little bit of a community where I can come to the table and be like, okay, I'm going to set up a stream and I want to talk about this today. And hopefully there'll be people in the live chat who can kind of throw their own 2 cents in, and we can it'll be an active process of discussing these ideas and developing them. And yeah, I've got 2 episodes out of the latest season, and there's going to be another 6 coming. But I'm kind of slowing down my production at the moment. The first season I did over the course of the pandemic when everyone was forced to be at home, and I was receiving like, money from the Canadian government because no one was able to work anymore. So that I was able to put out over the course of a year. Whereas now it's kind of like, okay, when can I find time between everything else that I'm doing to like sit down and read this or write that? So it's going to be a slower process, but I've been applying for grants and things like that because I do think that
Oh,
maybe someone would think the ideas are interesting enough to invest some actual money in, and that would be great for me because
do,
I do want to pursue this as a career in some way.
yeah. So how do you turn this into a career? Do you get hooked up with a think tank? Does Canada have think tanks?
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, do you foresee yourself taking this in a professional direction, and how would that work out?
The best way I can see is like just kind of doing the like, online public intellectual route where you're kind of doing whatever streams, YouTube videos, like, Substack, like monetizing through different pathways. I'd love to be able to at some point be doing like public speaking engagements and kind of debates and discussions and things like that. To me, I always think you have a better quality conversation. Like this has been great, but I always think if you're sitting in person, it's just a little bit more seamless and more engaging, or doing things in front of an audience and stuff like that. And then I'm not really sure if at some point, like I want to build up a community where I'm kind of like, okay, get all these ideas really like into as much of a approximating an actual functional charter as you can. But there's just so much in the realm of politics to really think about and unpack and go down these different things, especially if you're trying to do it all from scratch. You're not just going to be like, however divorce law works now is where it'll just re-implement it. It's like, no, really think about like, how does this make the most sense to do in line with the principles that we've established? So I'm not sure, like now I've kind of gotten what I was saying earlier about like the aesthetics of a city, like, and I'm a little bit more tantalized by like, is it really possible? Could you really get together a group of people that are like actually wanting to go and do something on the ground? Is that feasible or not? But then I also kind of like my dreams for my career always kind of like peter off in the next like 5 to 10 years because I really want to homeschool my kids for at least a decade or something like that. So,
Okay,
which to me is kind of like a continuation of like, as I said earlier, the last episode is going to be about education. And so part of that to me is like, I really want to homeschool my kids, because I think the public education system is awful right now. And I want my kids to be, challenged and made as smart as they can be, but also because I'm very interested in like psychology and the developmental components of that. And like, just again, thinking through kind of like doing sort of like first principles investigation of like what are the best ways to like, rear a child so that they're really thriving. So that to me is kind of part of the process, but then that leaves me at like 40 or something being like, okay, so now where have I landed with my attempts to investigate political philosophy and kind of talk about cultural commentary stuff.
And is there something that you do that's just frivolous and fun or weird and dorky, like for a hobby of some sort?
It's a good question. What do I do that's frivolous and fun? I'm really bad at having hobbies, frankly. Like I'm not somebody who like, plays tennis or does like watercolor painting or anything like that. I have this theory, maybe this is like rude to say. It's probably rude to say and I'm probably just making it up because I'm like rationalizing why I don't have hobbies. But like I think some people are like, if they're not so internally focused and like just, if they're not really cerebral and kind of constantly working with ideas, then you're kind of will be someone who's like, yeah, I'd love to go and play tennis and I ride horseback and I do all these things because you're filling your life with like stuff out there. Whereas I feel like most of my life is like I'm listening to podcasts and I'm reading books and I'm meditating and I'm doing yoga, but it's all very like internal. I like playing video games a lot, but I haven't had a gaming PC in a while, which I'm trying to fix with the live streaming thing. I'm
live stream.
This close to buying a gaming PC so I can actually play games and have a higher quality setup than what I currently have right now. So that would be nice. I'd love to get back into gaming.
Putting the thought in the e-thought.
Yeah.
Thing. Yeah. Huh. And what video games?
Well, for a while, I mean, I know this is not popular anymore, but I was a big Overwatch girl when that was...
Oh, really?
When that's popular, yeah. I like shooters. I like playing something that's competitive. I find like when I play like long form, like there's some games like, like I like Fallout or something like that, but I find sometimes if it's too, one of those games where you can invest like 40 to 80 hours just in like an open world or something, I'll kind of like, it feels too much like, wow, I'm really just like, there's a whole world in here, but it's also such a clear drain on like, I could be doing anything else with my time.
Yeah.
Whereas like the rapid, like competitive, that to me isn't easier because it's only 10, 15 minutes. You're in and out. It feels like more like you're honing something because you're like shooting the bad guys. I like that a little bit more.
And your YouTube channel is into Wonderland as well?
Pardon?
Your YouTube channel's name is the same
Jane
as
Gatsby.
Oh, Jane. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Just the Substack is Welcome to Wonderland, but I have a second Substack, which is Jane Gatsby. So basically on any platform, it's Jane Gatsby. And then Wonderland is one of hopefully many things I want to go down. But that for me is like kind of the basis, the foundation of reference material for people that are interested in my ideas.
Are you going to go on to write a book, or right now this is just a collection of essays or kind of a treatise?
Yeah, I mean, Curtis, when he looked at my blog, he's like, "Oh, you're writing a book," and I was like, "Oh, I hadn't thought that before, but I guess you're right." I do think it's something where if I wanted to, probably like after maybe a couple of years after finishing the series, to kind of like revisit it with some maturity and really edit it and really take it again, I could probably turn it into a book. I want to write a children's book one day, which is completely unrelated, except for the kind of the philosophy of story, I guess. But that's to come later.
Yeah. Well, Jane, thanks a lot for swinging by the channel again. I think we spoke, what was it, 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, maybe?
2.5. It was right after Sexy James Lindsay. It was like November.
Sexy, yeah. So it was right. Yeah, it was right after that Halloween costume that you put out there, and so it was great to see like how you have progressed, and you certainly have. So
thank you so much.
Encourage you.
It's been a pleasure to chat.
Yeah,
Keep going.
Keep at it.